shape. So whichever one you want.
Right, there we go. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Saturday Morning Mastermind. I'm your host, Samantha Studebaker Carl, broadcasting to you from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm here with my good friend Karen Lohoff. And today we are going to continue our discussion of, let me grab my book here real quick, Leonardo and Gabriel by Tim Tigner. And we are on the chapter entitled, what's this one called? Actions. And last week we talked about the first couple of actions of God, one of which was the unmoved mover, or the one who, God started everything, or the impetuous of all action. And then the second one was, what was the second one? God is a creator. And then the third one was God is a judge. And so we got onto the topic of God being a judge. Actually, I think we talked about the first two, the previous discussion, and then judgment the last time. But we may still have a little bit more to talk about on the judgment aspect of it, and then we can go on and see where we end up this week. So, but before we get going, I want to give my friend Karen an opportunity to jump out and introduce herself, and then we can get this conversation going. Jump out.
Good morning. I'm Karen Lohoff, and I'm in Mesa, Arizona. And today isn't as bright as some of the days. Maybe it's getting there. Anyway, we're warm and cozy. I think we're in the 70s this last week, and expected to be in the 70s. The Phoenix Open, which is the Waste Management Open now, is going on, and people are loving it.
What is that? Is that like the Open Phoenix Open? Open. That's like a golf thing, right?
Like golf thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not a golf person, so I'm not entirely sure. But sometimes terms will be like, "Oh, that I think I know what you're talking about." Cool.
Yeah, I'm not a golfer either, but I'll tell you, it's all the talk.
I got you there. It's like here in Indianapolis in May, it's always about the Indy 500. That's all they talk about, for the whole month of May, and then some. So I get it. Okay, so this chapter called Actions, let's kind of just review just a little bit for anybody who's just jumping on with us. In this book, Leonardo da Vinci is kind of the main character. It's a fictional book, but they're kind of using him as an example of a person who thinks of things in more of a logical fashion versus just being guided by what other people say. And so he is trying to create the Last Supper painting, and he's struggling with a couple of different aspects of it. One of which is the face of Judas, and the other is the face of Jesus. And so he's having kind of these visions, if you will, or dreams, where he's talking with Gabriel, the archangel, and they're discussing what the characteristics, or what are the definitions of God and his qualities. And so that, because Leonardo's struggling with that, he's struggling with some of these aspects of God, and so he really wants to be able to create an image of Jesus that feels right to him. So the first part, if we kind of go back just a little bit, we've talked so far of they're kind of like creating this little tablet that has a list of was it 10 different 10 spaces that are kind of the defining qualities of God. And the first three are, wait, I just saw a review of this just a moment. Okay, the first three abilities, 3 characteristics, and 3 actions, and then the 10th space as a placeholder, a reminder, which we haven't covered yet. And so in this chapter, we're talking about the 3 actions, and I kind of mentioned a little bit about that at the beginning. And last week we ended on talking about God as a judge, and that most monotheistic religious groups kind of tend to think that God is a judge and that when we die, then we stand before him and he judges our actions and determines whether or not we go to heaven or hell. And of course, Leonardo in here he's kind of questioning that, and they're having this discussion about, um, whether or not this seems like he's just questioning it. And so then there's a section in here where he says, I'm puzzled by what it means for God to judge all things. The church would have us believe that the righteous go to heaven and the wicked go to hell. But he says that's a single binary decision, and it seems contradictory to the fundamental idea that God judges all things. And then he also goes on and kind of talks about it seeming like a crude and uninspired shortcut, with the fact that, as we live throughout our lives, we make millions and millions of decisions every day, and some of them may end up being considered good, some of them may be considered bad, and then there's all the aspects to every, underlying possibility of what a decision could equal out to. Sometimes you're making a good decision in a good way, and yet it affects things out in the world that it turns out that maybe it's not such a good thing, And so he's just kind of questioning that a little bit. But then they go on and they're talking about how the church has kind of created, or not necessarily created, we're just speculating that maybe that they have come up with these ideas as a simplistic way to connect with a larger group of people. And then he says this inherent need to simplify ideas enough to make them digestible by every patron is another reason why. He's kind of discussing this. He says heaven and hell are concepts that most modest minds could grasp. And then, but then he goes on and said that it's simplify ideas enough to make them digestible by every patron is another reason why you would be better served by disregarding doctrine for the purposes of our discussion. So he's talking about this in terms of, let's disregard where the idea comes from, and we're just going to put this down as this is a thing that typically is believed by most religious organizations, and for the sake of our discussion. So, because then they're talking about how such a simplistic scheme clearly serves the church's interest, puts a lot of people, fear of hell puts a lot of people in the pews and fills the church's, donation dishes and that sort of thing. So they're talking about this, and of course, when we had our discussion last week, we kind of touched on an idea of, it's like, is judgment really a thing? What would the world be like if we didn't believe that God was a judge? Because we've talked about God as benevolent previously, and it's like, how can he be benevolent and then also be a judge? So we kind of talked a little bit about that. What are your thoughts on judgment, Karen? Because I question that as to whether or not I really feel like God is judgmental. I feel like people are very judgmental. But God, I've never felt that way when I, feel like I'm talking to God, or having a prayer with, or, I've never really felt like that, So anyway, jump out. Tell me what you think.
Well, I certainly know that I'm judgmental. I have really been thinking about that the last several years and paying more attention and more notice to, that's a judgment that I'm making, as opposed to that's how things really are, or that's life. I recognize I'm just making my own judgment about stuff. And I also notice that there's a lot of people around me that are making a lot of judgments that I feel like they shouldn't be making. Like, it seems inappropriate to me that caregivers, for example, here at the home would be making judgments and mocking residents it's just not. There's just certain things that it would seem to me that to learn how to do, to learn appropriate behaviors for certain settings, it wouldn't include judgment, which would mean in most cases that people would need to be trained out of it, would need to have it pointed out to them. This is not a place where it's appropriate for you to be making this judgment or that judgment. And because the rest of the list has been things that I can't own up to. When we talked about um, you were having a little bit of a problem earlier calling out the list, and I'm having a hard time what it was called. But when we went through omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence, none of those can I claim. Those I can assign to God without saying I have a portion of that. And I can't think of the other three right now either, and assign them. But definitely, when I think about judgment, I think judgment is definitely a man kind of thing. And it's certainly very difficult to consider that God could, you know, could just. I mean, I guess I think of it a little bit like the baby, where was it? Samson held the baby up by the leg and said, "I'll just slice this baby in two, and you two women can each have half of the baby." I mean, judgment can sometimes, in my opinion, be that ridiculous. I don't know. I don't know that I'm making any sense at all, but I think this is a healthy consideration. Does God judge? And should we take it for granted? Should we just put it on the list and just assume that everybody thinks that? And it seems a little bit like they went ahead and put it on the list with the question still in mind. So I'm not sure exactly what's going to happen with that.
Yeah, and I think they kind of address that a little bit of saying, it seems like judgment is just a very, very simplistic way of viewing things in the grand scheme of everything, and but that it's typically taught by a lot of religious groups, and but it makes me wonder. We kind of come back to one of the weeks we were talking about worthy of worship, and because that was one of the it was the what do we say that it was characteristics and let me grab the book again, pull that page back up. I don't know how important it is that I say what these different things are, but where am I not? Or here, the three things. I just said them earlier. Abilities, characteristics, and actions. Okay, that was what we were talking about. And his the abilities were the ones that was omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent. And then the characteristics, one of which was worthy of worship, and I don't remember what the other ones were on there. But anyway, now I've lost my train of thought. I was talking about, dang it, I hate it when that happens. I'm going to start thinking about something else. The judgment aspect. Okay, we're kind of taught that that God is worthy of worship, but why do we think that? I think that a lot of times we think that we've just been taught that way, and I feel like judgment is another one where it's just been kind of like taught to us that that this is what we're supposed to do. And yet in the book, they're kind of addressing it as maybe these are more church serving things versus, really serving the people as something that's helpful. And it's just kind of like these, I don't know, in my opinion, just kind of just like little simplistic ideas of rather than, and last week we kind of talked a little bit about, um, why it may be, just the fact that it's a simple idea. It's easy to teach people that, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, it's going to be cut and dry. You're either going to go to heaven or you're going to go to hell. Rather than, thinking in terms of like when I was raising my kids, I feel like that, if you don't do what I say and what I, tell you should do because I said so, is kind of the same thing as God being judgmental. Is it's just he's going to say because I said so. And but yet when I was what I guess what I was kind of alluding to as far as being a parent is that I tried not to do that. I tried not to just say, okay, you can or you can't do something just because I said so. I tried to be more, okay, let's open ourselves up to what are the possible benefits or consequences to this particular thing that you're wanting to do or you wanted me to approve or whatever, and explore that. And I wonder, I mean, I get in a lot of ways that, churches, they want to teach people some basic values, and sometimes it's just easier to say, this is just because, rather than explaining all the possible aspects of, why you shouldn't be jealous of what's the one commandment that has to do with jealousy? It's like do not covet, or um, it's one of those. And it's like, but why? Because so many people, they are, right? They have the and I even have that sometimes where something will happen and I'll have this just like feeling come up inside myself that, I'll be jealous for whatever reason. And yet I know that that is not a healthy emotion for me because it just causes me more frustration or anger or resentment or um, dissatisfaction in one way or another. And if I feel like we taught more about, why the reasons behind these ideas of why we shouldn't, I mean, obviously, it seems obvious to me, do not kill is a pretty obvious one, right? But at the same time, eh, when they just say, here's the 10 commandments, do not kill, there's no explanation behind that. And maybe back then, I don't know, maybe they didn't feel like people were smart enough to figure out why you shouldn't kill. I don't know. I don't know. I'm kind of rambling now, I feel like, but I don't know. I feel like if we kind of spent more time teaching values versus just saying you can't because that judgment I feel like is just not even a necessary thing. And I think that it's like you were saying, Karen, it's a human thing, I mean we you know how many times did I grow, when I was growing up, and my mom would tell us that we should act or be or dress or do or etc because she wanted to impress someone else or because she didn't want to look bad in front of someone else. And that is totally a thing where being worried about what someone else thinks is you're worried about being judged on that aspect. And yet I feel like it's so much more freeing when we can just let go of the idea that someone else is going to judge us and just be ourselves and do, I'm not saying go out there and kill people by any means. That's not my thought process, but I don't not kill people because I think I'm going to go to hell. I don't kill people because I know that, these actions have consequences, and it's not just about going to jail or ending up in the electric chair. It's because they have consequences against, with other people. They affect other people. And, not to mention the whole aspect of that would feel horrible to kill someone. I mean, there's that aspect too, but I mean, it affects more than just me. Just because I'm angry at someone or I don't like them doesn't mean I should just go kill them. And that seems obvious to me. I mean, I'm sure there's some people who think that that's the easier solution, but yeah, okay. I'm done rambling. Jump out there, Karen. Share some thoughts.
Well, I read a little plaque either last night or this morning that I think fits with that really well. And it says, worry about your character, not your reputation. And, or worry about your character because that's who you are. Don't worry about your reputation because that's who people think you are. And I thought about how that fits with what you were saying. Why aren't we taught a little bit more? Why don't we spend more time on values and why values are important and why not killing the neighbor boy because you're so mad at how good he is at something that you're really poor at, will affect his family forever. And, just a lot of things that people don't seem to understand today. I really do think there is a gap today in what young people tend to understand as values and why, why, for example, not vape. Vaping affects and cigarette smoking affects other people besides just the person who does it. And I wonder how often people who do that think about that at all, pay any attention to that at all, and care about somebody else's ability to breathe, down the road, or who knows what else is being affected by some of these chemicals and stuff. It's like we don't really think about that. I also read this morning off of my phone. Probably a lot of people did read this. There's a lot of people in Iran that are affected by traumatic brain injury. And they showed the example of the hit on one of the towns. And, who's talking about these things and considering these things? We should all be considering these things and having some input and making a difference and not going ahead with just a lot of things that we're going ahead with. Next thing I'll be talking about the woolly mammoth.
Something popped up for me when you were just talking about the people in Iran and whoever is making these decisions to do stuff over there and not thinking about the consequences. Seems like there was another book that we read, I don't know, sometime in the past, and they had brought up this example of a leader had said to, or an advisor had said to some leader that I want you to think about, before you make a decision to, send a bomb squad in, is that, if you instead had to, before you just make a blanket decision, is that instead of just making this decision and sending it off for someone to do, is that you literally had to kill a person in front of you first so that, you were on board with exactly what it is that you're doing when you send bombs out to bomb whoever it is that before you make that decision to kill, is you actually have to kill someone so that you can make that decision. How would that change your perspective on having to, on that decision making process? Because I think that, we see stuff on TV all the time, TV and movies and then books, and people are getting killed all over the place, and I feel like, it kind of desensitizes all of us to what that really means. And And so, I think that, like you were talking about those folks in Iran, and they're having these brain injuries. I'm guessing because they were just within a radius of whatever bombings were happening, and and whoever's sending those bombs over there, or sending the folks over there to kill. I mean, they're not just ending the lives of people who are supposedly the instigators of whatever terrorism they're trying to avoid, or I mean, there's all these other people that are involved with it. It's not just the one person. It's just when we were talking about, killing an individual, you're killing the boy across the street. I mean, it, you have to think about all the other people that are going to be affected by that, and I feel like they just kind of make this blanket decision of, oh, it's for the greater good or whatever, and it's like, well, who decides? I mean, obviously they're deciding, but I mean, I don't know. I'm just, that's like a whole other, I'm being judgmental of that. Um, but another thing that came up when you were talking about like the smoking and people not taking in people into consideration, and then we're talking about God as a judge. And a while back, I had read a book called Conversations with God. Have you ever read that, Karen? Yeah, it's been a long time since I've read, I mean, a number of years, but in there, they pose this idea that God he's not a judge. He is just basically helping to guide you by making suggestions, if you will, or saying, okay, you say, God talking to, man, you say you want peace. You say you want harmony. You say you want to be happy. And yet you keep doing all these things that are causing you to go down the path of not happy, and not peace, not harmony, and all of those kind of things. I'm not sitting here being judgmental. I'm just trying to say, hello, you keep saying you want this, but you keep going down this path. Maybe you might want to make different decisions, and so that's kind of where I'm at. It's like, well, maybe that's what ultimately they would like to teach in, in religious or in church or whatever, is that, hello, let's draw attention to what you're doing that's causing you to have the suffering in your life that you say you don't want. And maybe if you shine some light on that, then you might realize you're doing it to yourself. And but that's a hard thing for people to take. And so maybe it's easier even for people to accept that, okay, God is just going to judge me, and and I can leave that fault on Him instead of it being my own fault that my life is miserable, and that I can't, because that means I have to take responsibility for where I am in my life, right? That if I take that responsibility and realize I'm doing it to myself, maybe I can make changes, even though I'm trying to blame it all on everyone else and say, I'm rambling again. God love me.
Well, I agree. I think judgment's a huge issue. And I think from my own experience of trying to recognize how much I do it, and how narrow it is that I, look at things, as long as I'm looking at somebody else, I just realize it's not an easy thing to do, and judgment itself makes an impact. But anyway, I think it might be interesting for us to get into the 10th line that is not a characteristic, but it's something that really Gabriel gigs. I think he really gigs Leonardo about how difficult Leonardo's going to find this concept to consider. And I certainly know for myself that I find it a difficult concept to consider. Um, do you want to introduce that, Samantha?
Yeah, sure. I've got some stuff underlined in the chapter that I can kind of draw attention to with that. Um, okay, so he moves from talking about the three abilities, characteristics, and actions, and says that the 10th space on this tablet is a placeholder or a reminder. And he says, I added the space to draw attention to a serious misperception, a mental roadblock, a barrier we must lift with logic before we proceed. And of course, Leonardo is like, I've demonstrated I have an open mind. And Gabriel's like, well, like everyone else, you've been conditioned. A lifetime of repetition has led you to embrace a false proposition, to internalize a sticky misperception. And Leonardo's like, what? Wait a second here. What? How have I been conditioned? A lifetime of repetition? Now I'm intrigued. How can I, what are we talking about here? And Gabriel goes on and he says, this particular bit of misinformation is so inconspicuous and common that you and I have repeated it a dozen times during our discussion. And so Leonardo is still sitting there wondering, and Gabriel's like, the incorrect assumption is so deeply ingrained that switching away from it will feel like diverting the flow of a mighty river. And he said, but if you wish to become enlightened, you got to swim through to the other side. And I say this even though logic will convince you that the conclusion is unquestionably correct. And so then Leonardo is like, okay, so what assumption could cause me to forgo logic? He's super curious now. And so Gabriel starts asking him questions. He says, let's just kind of look at this for a moment, and says, first of all, does God reproduce? And so we can kind of touch on these kind of questions. Does God reproduce? And of course, we've all been, well, not all, we in Christianity have been taught that we are God's children, but yet reproduce, in my opinion, is not the same as being God's children. It's reproduce is like, when I reproduce, obviously I have a child, and that child is of similar likeness to myself and is also a human, right? When I reproduce, I don't create a dog, I create another human. And if God were to reproduce, then I would think that God would create another God, right? And so, in my opinion, I don't see God as I don't see God as reproducing. Um, but yet we've talked about God as a creator. So, what are your thoughts on that question, Karen? Does God reproduce?
Well, it's interesting. It is a question I've had for a long time, that I've I guess kind of played with, that God does reproduce, because I think I mentioned a couple of times ago that one of the things that was going to come up here with this, for example, is that I was taught, and this is something that maybe in my bringing up, I was alone. I don't know that there are other churches that believe this, but I was taught that, we eventually, over time, become gods ourselves and do reproduce and reproduce worlds. And so in the thinking of that, of course, I wasn't able to leave out the thing that tends to create problems for lots of women, and I think there are many men for whom it creates problems too, and that is the idea that polygamy is something that goes on, and that did not suit me very well. I'm sure that there were lots of women who had the same idea that I did, that once you got there, somehow you would have this magic ability to be the only wife to whoever you were wife to, and that you could go ahead and create your world, just the two of you. But it really became far-fetched the more I became acquainted with things, and I started to become acquainted with things, with people who were involved in that kind of thing when I went away to school, because as most folks now are aware, on the Utah-Arizona border, there are towns of polygamists, and you know, when I lived in St. George, Utah for about 10 years, we had a Walmart there that was the biggest or most visited Walmart in the country because of the polygamists. And so anyway, I have thought about that, and I have thought about it in terms of yes, and I don't I don't quite go along with. There's something else I want to bring up, hopefully, before we end this session that he talks about here. But I don't know really how I feel about that at this point. There are so many things that I'm reviewing in my mind. Just about everything I review in my mind with, yeah, well, where did I get that? Because I realized that I was brainwashed, clearly brainwashed in one aspect, and that tells me that I was likely brainwashed in many others, and certainly many things were softened so that unless you wanted to take, I did take a lot of extra religion courses when I was at BYU, and they were by, the high end of looking at certain things. And by doing that, of course, it was always, well, this is meat. This is not milk. And it's interesting how you can look at any of that, and you can start to see how intertwined all of that can be with essentially garbage, or essentially stuff that serves someone else or bunches of someone else over what it does yourself or people that you know, and how important it is to think about things and think things through and think about things ahead. If people think about, for example, killing ahead of doing it, like you were saying, thinking about killing an individual before sending the bombs over, that changes a lot. I think just using our minds, our brains, changes things a lot. And I'm going to have to use my brain a lot more on whether or not God reproduces.
Yeah, and I think that also it depends on what type of reproducing we're talking about too. We're just talking about in terms of biologically speaking. We've already determined that God he can't be human because he's omniscient, omnipotent, and omnipresent. He can't be everywhere and everything and in everywhere and know everything if he's human, obviously, because if he was human, then we don't have that ability, right? And so I think that if we're talking in terms of biologically speaking, then I would feel that he isn't a reproducing, human being. And but yet, if we talk about him as a creator, and the fact that, or not the fact that, just him as a creator and one who who created everything, then, and if he infuses himself within everything, then we could say that he is reproducing himself, um, in everything, in every way, in every option, shape, and form, right? So, and then I had never, I'm not very familiar at all with the religions that involve polygamy. I have no knowledge of that at all. And so I'm getting the impression from what you were just saying, Karen, that that part of that polygamy aspect is the thought process that you are reproducing, um, because of, of course, as a man, you can reproduce unlimited if you have enough people to help you out with that. And if you're thinking that you are reproducing in the aspect of reproducing an aspect of God, is that what the thought process is? Am I getting that?
I'm not sure I quite followed what you were saying. Um,
Because I'm not sure what the belief is behind polygamy. I guess that's kind of my question. But if in that religious, um, belief system, they're thinking that by, having multiple wives, you're able to reproduce much faster, and and if you're creating, um, because you believe that you are godlike or are an aspect of God, and by creating more or reproducing faster with multiple women, um, perpetuates that process faster. Is that, I'm just,
well,
if that's just my own just drawing of a conclusion, or that doesn't have anything to do with it. I'm not sure.
can you mute your mic because I'm getting back?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Um, that's interesting because I realized that there's two aspects of learning about polygamy. The aspect that was supposedly the justification that Joseph Smith, who began things in the 1800s, used, and that was that there weren't enough men for the women that needed to be able to get across the plains, to get safely across the plains. And if you look at that historically, what's interesting is he never would have married me at 70 years old to make sure I made it across the plains. He was going for young girls, and so things kind of died out, basically because the United States was in an uproar about the idea of polygamy. Nobody liked the idea of polygamy, and so it became illegal. And so the church stopped it, except for the ones that slipped off to Mexico, which is why there were still polygamous families in Mexico that got killed these last few months. However, there's lots of breaks from the church, and many of the breaks from the church still practice polygamy. They openly practice polygamy. That's part of what they're doing. But the main part of the church doesn't, but they nonetheless, in a separate way of looking at polygamy, talk about polygamy in the afterlife, so that so that more people can be produced, because, as you say, one man can produce a lot, and will require several women to manage all of that comes from that. I always found it so egregious, so sickening to my very being, that it was like I could not tolerate allowing all of that to come into my mind. And it was relatively easy to keep it out of my mind because, the church was in a position of saying we don't practice polygamy anymore. But the fact was, it was in our heads. And, and it was practiced, it's still practiced. If my husband that I married in the temple wants to marry someone else, he can marry her in the temple. I cannot marry someone else in the temple. And it's just it's amazing to me that it is so difficult for human beings to talk about religion and about what they believe, that I can go essentially my whole lifetime not satisfied. I tried to talk to my father when I came home from BYU, and he finally had to tell me to go to bed. I was so upset. He just had to tell me, just go to bed. And I still obviously get upset about it. Why wouldn't I get upset about it?
Yeah, I mean, I understand why it's hard for people to talk about religion. I don't think it should be this hard, or not. I mean, I feel like we're talking about it fine. Um, but I feel like it shouldn't be that hard to discuss different opinions on things. It shouldn't be hard to ask the questions, questioning, where these beliefs came from, why we have them, what they truly mean, what the consequences are if we didn't believe them or if we changed our ideas about them. I just don't feel like it should be that difficult. But again, I feel like, then it comes back to this whole judgment aspect too, and fear. A lot of people are very fearful, and we're afraid that someone else is going to believe something different than us, and they may be more right than we are, and then we will have lost some aspect of ourselves, maybe in some way that is hard. People are just so very, very not everyone, because I mean, obviously, we're able to discuss these things without getting angry, and I wonder sometimes, also, I mean, years ago, if we're trying to have we're questioning something that our parents believe, usually that creates confrontation, right? And so, and the parent doesn't want to have to sit there for 2 hours and justify themselves, especially if they don't know the answer. Sometimes, I mean, I know my dad wasn't big on religious studies, and he didn't go to church all the time, but yet, he sent us to a Christian school and expected us to have certain beliefs. And if we had a different opinion on that or had a question about it, he would just refer us back. Here's the Bible. This is what it says, and that's the way it is. He didn't want to have a discussion about it necessarily because this is his belief, and he didn't want to have to justify it. And but yet if we were to be able to have conversations, open conversations about things, I feel like we would grow so much more as in general, just because we're able to question and come to conclusions like Leonardo and Gabriel are. They're having a discussion. This is what we've been taught. This is what this is what I've experienced. This is what's going on. What do we think about that? And so I think it's good to be able to discuss things, and but we have to be open to other people's opinions first. We have to be open to um, understanding where ideas come from, and being sympathetic to that, and impact and empathetic to it as well. And am I using the right words there? Sympathetic and empathetic. I mean. Uh, and I think that holds true for anything, not just religion. Anytime we have a conversation with someone and they have a different idea than what we have, instead of immediately putting up our wall of defense, is to opening the door to that person's ideas and and then, and hopefully they're going to be opening the door to your ideas, and maybe you both might learn something. So, I mean, I feel like we learn a lot when we have these discussions, and it opens us up to other ideas, and in the week between our talks, I think about these things, and other ideas come in my head, and it's like, okay, well, what if this, and what if that, and and I've never been struck down by lightning because I was having these thoughts and questioning ideas. So I'm thinking it's not a bad thing. you know? Oh, we're at the top of the hour again, without having finished this chapter. Anyway, so I think that we'll probably talk on the rest of this idea about does God reproduce? Because we still really haven't even gotten to the final misconception that Gabriel is bringing up to Leonardo. Um, I don't know. Any final thoughts, Karen, before we wrap up for today? And we can definitely address this again next week.
I just really agree with all the things that you said at the end, and how important it is that we do open ourselves and share with one another. And there's two of us that haven't been struck by lightning. So if anybody else wants to join us, that would be great. And I love you, Sam. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for starting this.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, when you first mentioned this book, I was curious as to what the direction was going to go, because we haven't really studied a fictional book before, and even though this is a fiction book, it's still, I mean, it opens us up to so many different ideas when we're talking about God and religion, and I think it's a great kind of just we thought it was going to be a short read. Look at this tiny little book. We've been on it for a while, so I think it's wonderful that we're able to just really open up our minds and our hearts to just having these discussions, and I hope that we can continue to do that as we move forward. So anyway, it was great talking with you, Karen, and I love you too. I'm so glad that we're on here together, and hopefully Dan will be back with us again next week. I know he's kind of struggling with some personal things, and and then Catherine as well, and everybody. And it was nice to have Jason there for a week. So hopefully everybody can come back on and add to our conversation. I know that this can be a difficult topic for folks, but for those of you who are out there and would love to jump in on a discussion where we talk about religion, we ask the big questions, then there'll be a link below this video here on YouTube where you can jump in our Facebook group and just let us know you want to participate. We'd be happy to have you on. So with that, have a great, awesome, amazing week, and we'll see you next week on the Saturday Morning Mastermind. Bye for now.